As a clinician, sometimes I would assess a child for hypervigilance or avoidance, guilt or shame, disrupted trust in adults or systems. Oftentimes, I could rule out that maybe it was a general anxiety disorder that she had or a post-traumatic stress disorder. Welcome to Coach Soul, the podcast where we explore therapeutic ways to the best versions of ourselves. I'm your host, Steve Hudgins. I'm a licensed professional counselor dedicated to helping you navigate life's challenges. In each uplifting episode, we'll discuss mental health, relationships, self-care, emotional well-being, and personal growth. Join me and with my co-host, Kenya Evelyn, a therapeutic life coach, where sometimes we'll even welcome special guests to our show that share their experience and expertise. So let's embark on this transformative path together and discover a healthier and happier you. All right, welcome back to Coach Soul. Kenya's on vacation this week, and I wanted to speak something a little bit dear to my heart. It's a book that was published, and then we read it in high school for a book report. I remember living in Japan, going to high school on the base, and one of our teachers had to leave, and we received someone who was unique. She was a history teacher, but also an attorney, and we were able to do a mock trial, and I thought it was so interesting of how the mock trial went. We even went to a court martial on base and was able to watch a court martial, which is interesting. It's people arguing their points, and when you think about how this shapes, it's important to look at different viewpoints without saying, well, you offended me, or you're a racist, you're a narcissist, and then cut off all information. I've said it once and I'll say it again, that when America was built upon different forms of opinions. We were able to sit and have opinions that developed this nation into a good nation. Today we have division. We still have ongoing racism. It's still unhealthy thinking. At what point are we able to look at a variety of different things? A lot of times I tell my clients who are couples counseling, one will argue their point to make it right. And I will say, well, maybe he believes the moon is made out of cheese and she believes the moon is made out of rock. Okay, it could be vice versa. Not picking on any gender race here. Just the fact that just for example, that he believes the rock is made out of cheese, he's made it out of rock. Well, neither one's been to the moon. So how can we argue that this point is right? What we can do is conclude that there are multiple options here that we can agree. According to atmospheric conditions, there are 36 different types of colors the moon takes on. And so when you think about that piece, we can also agree that the moon rises during the day, it rises at night. We can look at the fact that there's eclipses that happen with the moon. There's so many different variety of things that we can look at for the moon than just to argue two specific points. So when you think about on July the 11th in 1960, which today is July the 11th, 2025, so this book is quite old. And so when you think about this aspect of it, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird was released into a world wrestling with injustice, and it hasn't stopped speaking since. So today on Coach Soul, we're going to slow this down to see a story through the eyes of Scout Finch. What does her story tell us about childhood, emotional development, and the quiet times that shape us? Scout was a child that was in the story that was a prominent figure, and I'll give you a synopsis so you can catch up exactly where we are. Scout witnessed what many of us did as children, things we couldn't fully name, but can never forget. And so childhood experiences shapes our mental health. And when you think about that, how does that shape it? Well, let's give us a backstory into To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a classic American novel, as I shared earlier, that Harper Lee set in the 1930s. Racially segregated town of Macomb, Alabama. The story is through the eyes of a young girl named Scout Finch, as she navigates childhood alongside her brother Jim and their wise principal father, Atticus Finch. Now, Atticus was an attorney. Now, can you imagine imagine your father being an attorney. But back into the 1930s, Atticus, a prominent attorney, defends a black man named Thomas Robinson, who is falsely accused of assaulting a white woman. Now, Atticus' children, Scott and Jim, witnessed the harsh realities of racism, injustice, and moral courage. At the same time, the children were fascinated and frightened, but the reclusive neighbor, Boo Radley, whom the town has turned into a ghost story. Over time, they come to understand that not everything is as it seems, and that true kindness often hides behind misunderstood silence. This novel explores deep themes of prejudice, childhood innocence, moral development, and the quiet strength it takes to stand for what is right, even when the world around you does not. So one of the things, if we were to look at Scout, she's exposed to multiple layered stressors without a consistent framework to fully process them. If we take the modern insight and look through To Kill a Mockingbird, it doesn't show long-term dysfunction in Scout, yet she's a child exposed to prolonged community injustice, emotional neglect, even unintentionally, or confusing adult behavior may internalize these experiences as personal fault or insecurity. So as a clinician, sometimes I would assess a child for hypervigilance or avoidance, guilt or shame, disrupted trust in adults or systems. Oftentimes I could rule out that maybe it was a general anxiety disorder that she had or a post-traumatic stress disorder. But when you look at the character of Scout, it's almost like she has an adjustment disorder because what's happening. Scout's navigating a significant emotional upheaval. Racism, community betrayal, fear, Abu Radley, and social confusion. When we look at the book, we often can see anxiety and questioning in her character, emotional sensitivity, defiance, or curious behavior. Although the book is not overtly described of her difficulty of sleeping or feeling secure, these symptoms arise in response to identifiable stressors, but do not fully meet what we call the PTSD criteria. So when we think about today, maybe take a moment to revisit your own childhood lens. What did your younger self witness that one helped you explain? And if you're raising or mentoring children, ask yourself, what stories are they writing in silence? Because I believe that in this book, Scout teaches us that children see everything, but it's up to us to help them to understand what they see. That's how we shape not just their memories, but their mental health, their identity, and their future relationships. So if a child comes to you and explains something, help them to try to understand, but be very careful not to mislead their thoughts and shape their memories. There was an event that a memory was altered because it was given to her by her mother. And so the father was not able to bounce back from that because he was trying to also explain his defense about what had happened. And the little child grew up hating her father because the mother implanted memories that were not true about the situation based upon her biasness. So Scout's emotional journey mirrors that of countless children today. As adults, when we avoid hard conversations, children fill in the gaps with fear or shame. But when adults listen to really listen to children's interpretations, healing can begin. When you think about the stories kids tell themselves about hard moments become the stories they tell themselves about themselves. For example, a child sees a parent cry and assumes they did something wrong, unless someone says, "Daddy's sad because of something at work, not because of you." So in therapy, when I talk to children, I ask them, what do you believe happened? What did that moment mean to you? Or educators, don't dismiss children's questions. Help them find meaning, make meaning. Where parents were supposed to not just be protectors, but narrators. We're helping them. Adults narrate the world for kids by explaining death, divorce, and justice, not perfectly, but honestly. Because when children are helped to name what they see and feel, it builds that resilience. So when you think about a quote in the book, Atticus, he was real nice. Most people are Scout when you finally see them. Scout learns empathy, an antidote to trauma. She learns that people, even the quiet or strange ones, carry stories we don't see. This moment shows Scout's shift from innocence to insight. How often can prejudice be wiped away if we begin to understood the concept that we're different? And it's okay to be different. What's not okay is to hurt someone in society and call it normal. because it's never normal. So a question to reflect upon is, did you ever see something as a child that made you feel unsafe, maybe misunderstood? Did the adults around you explain what was happening, or did they stay silent? Oftentimes I recall a memory of my grandmother telling me stories about the family, but at the same time, when I prompted questions, she says they were quiet. They didn't discuss very much. All I know is that we have some type of heritage or royalty in Ireland, and her family had to go back to royal court in Ireland to discuss the family, whatever. But we don't get the full story of the picture. So when you think about the psychological insight, children are sponges for stress. Research has shown that transgenerational trauma can happen. When you think about the African American community as the reason why rates of incarcerated men are so high is because their fathers are ripped away. So it's time to begin healing. Trauma, even indirect, can cause confusion, fear, or deep emotional shifts. And so children don't just hear what adults say. They feel what adults feel. This even starts in the mother's womb when the mother's pregnant, and if mom is having something going on in her life or high anxiety, passes on. And so when you think about children as sponges for stress, it's looking at the fact that what are we doing to create a safe environment for our children? They're often afraid of the dark. They're afraid of certain things. Do we dismiss it? Do we help them? I mean, think about it. A child's afraid of the dark, and what do we immediately do? Try to find a nightlight for them not to be afraid. Scout is full of questions. She's curious, tough, and tender. And she learns the world isn't always fair, even when her dad is. So when you think about this book, and I look at, the perspective of Scout, how did this impact her father as an attorney, defending injustice? And being able to disputing injustice, my apology for the misquote there. How do children resolve their own issues as kids? What do we help them do when they're facing fear? When you think about To Kill a Mockingbird, there's so much going on to unpack in this. When you think about fear, Jim says, I heard him scratching on the window. And like Boo Radley, children's fears may not always be logical, but they're real to them. So instead of dismissing it, you acknowledge that feeling. That sounds scary. Want to tell me more about what you're feeling? How often have we heard adults or our own parents have said, that's nothing. Don't be silly. Naming the fear helps shrink it. Silence grows it. Explain hard truths gently and honestly. When you think about Atticus, he said, the one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience. That stuck out to me when I read this book, because when Scout asks questions about the trial or the hatred she sees, Atticus gives clear, age-appropriate answers. So when you think about when children, are overwhelmed, just tell the child the truth without overwhelming the detail. In other words, according to the book, some people treat others unfairly because they're afraid of what's different. That's not right, and it's not your fault. At the same time, you may have a feeling of an adult of something that wasn't done to you, an injustice, or something in the world that just pisses you off. And so when it comes to your child, like Atticus, stay regulated. Atticus remains calm in the book, even when insulted or threatened. That calm of Atticus became Scout's and Jim's emotional anchor. So what are some things that you can do? Breathe, lower your voice, let your body model safety. I mean, if your hands are on your hips, that's not modeling safety. That's authoritarian type style. And so we want to be careful about how we model that language. Children borrow your nervous system. In other words, when you stay calm, they feel safe to the process of emotions. Another thing that I liked about in this book about Scout is that give them a role in making things right. Scout's journey includes learning empathy, standing up for others, and even walking Boo Radley home. It's interesting because I saw a Facebook reel of a couple who had a child in between, and they covered up this candy. And dad revealed he had candy. The boy revealed his, and he had 2 pieces of candy, and mom revealed hers, and she had nothing. And mom's voice goes, I don't have any. I didn't get any. And immediately the child starts to cry, looks down what he has, and hands her his piece of candy. So often we could be able to help kids be helpers. Writing kind notes, choosing books about fairness, caring for someone else, feeling powerless is terrifying, but giving them a role and agency heals. Normalize the wonder and mystery. So when you think about Boo Radley, he wasn't a monster. He was a quiet protector in the book. Sometimes what kids fear is just something they just don't understand. But yet in adulthood, isn't the same thing? We tend to fearmonger when news media causes this fear-mongering episodes and we don't understand, so we begin to fear. We're living in a society that's a knee-jerk reaction of control. What I mean by control is oftentimes we want to, because we're hurt, we want to quiet it down. I tend to equate, do we want to control or manage our life and what happens? And so a control is like a firefighter running down the pole because the alarm goes off to jump in the truck and rush to the fire to control it. But when you think about managing, it's a forest firefighter who clears the debris, who makes gaps in the dirt so the fire won't jump. And so when you think about managing or control, I much rather want to manage my life in peace. So again, sometimes what kids fear is just something they just don't understand. So you turn their fear into curiosity. Ask, what do you think his story might be? Read stories that stress their empathy, like To Killing a Mockingbird, together. And again, most of all, we don't allow this. And I remember growing up, oftentimes, and I hear it in clients who kind of grew up with me, is that we don't get to talk. I've shared in the podcast before that men stop one emotion, and that emotion is anger, because we're not allowed to express what we feel. Get up, suck it up, put some dirt on it. If you're going to cry, I'm going to give you something to cry about. And so that turns into a lot of emotional turmoil. So kids often need to revisit scary events multiple times to make sense of them. Sort of like Scared of the Dark. But it's okay to talk about this. Again, reassure them. Ask open-ended questions. What stuck with you about that? Or what would you say to that person now? There's a quote that I remember, by Judge Taylor. People generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for. So help children learn to look for goodness, even when the world feels scary. Be their mirror, their translator, and their calm shelter. Because Scout needs an Atticus to walk them through the dark. When you think about Atticus and Scout, he was a calm parent. Yes, it's a book. I get it. It's fictitious. But at the same time, is it really? Can we really model? So when you think about To Killing Mockingbird, and I look back at this book, it just reminds us the world can be confusing. If it's confusing to the adult, can you imagine what that's doing to the child? So in a world that feels confusing, unjust, even frightening to a child, the most powerful thing that we can offer isn't perfection, it's presence. Because when we listen without rushing and we speak with honesty and stay beside them in the dark, we teach them not just how to face fear, but how to walk through it with courage. So maybe we become safe in people's unsafe times. Maybe we help the Scouts of this world name what they feel. And may we never forget that fear often fades the moment someone finally feels seen. When I think about this and Scout's relationship with Atticus, when I think about how Atticus was able to, even though he was an attorney, he had some valid points. Scout is just not the narrator in the story. She's the emotional pulse of the story. And through her childlike eyes, we see the slow unraveling of childhood innocence and the quiet stitching of a deeper, wiser compassion. One thing that I really like is that she humanizes the other. How often can we learn about we need to be from our own children? Because she humanizes the other. In other words, Boo Radley, once a source of mystery and fear, becomes someone Scout protects and gently leads home. She looks at him and says, "Will you take me home?" She doesn't gawk. She doesn't stare. She doesn't ask questions. She simply walks him back, offering dignity and peace. Remember, children often model what adults forget: to meet difference with presence, not fear. Scout offers Boo what the town never did: safety without judgment. Another thing that I grasped out of this book that Scout learns to see with empathy, not defense. And how often do we get into defense mode? Atticus, her father, teaches her, you'll never really understand a person until you climb into their skin and walk around in it. And by the end, she does. She sees Boo's pain, Tom's injustice, Mayella's loneliness and even the burden of her father's quiet courage, Scout moves from instinctual reaction of hiding, questioning, resisting to regulated reflection. That's the healing journey, one any therapist or trauma survivor can recognize. It's what ways in our healing journey can we reflect and regulate a reflection. Scout invites the reader to heal with her. Because Scout is narrating the story as an adult, remembering her childhood, the entire novel becomes a therapeutic reflection. She's processing trauma not with bitterness, but with deepened understanding. She says, I was born good, but had grown progressively worse every year. Even her humor reveals a tender reckoning with identity, morality, and memory. Scout doesn't just witness injustice, she interrogates it. Her role models, Atticus, Miss Clemati, Calpurnia, offer her language, boundaries, and resilience. In turn, she offers the reader a mirror to ask, and I think it's an important question for us to ask of ourselves today. How do we make sense of things we saw too young? When I think about the story, Scout is the uncorrupted voice that saves the story. And so, as Paul Harvey was to say in the radio, now for the rest of the story. Where adults grow weary, biased, or bitter, Scout remains fiercely observant and morally fresh. In the face of a violent system, she remains deeply intact. In a full of whispering shame, she speaks truth. In a courtroom twisted by racism, her young presence reminds us of what's at stake. The next generation. Children are often the ones who call us back to our truest values. Scout's clarity and compassion offer a blueprint for how innocence can become wisdom without becoming hard. Scout Finch reminds us that healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it climbs into someone's skin, walks them home, and let the silence speak. In the end, she doesn't need to change the world. She just needs to see it. And that act alone brings light where others only saw shadows. So, if we're lucky, we each have a little Scout in us, the part that still believes most people are nice once you finally see them. So, until next time, take care. God bless. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on Coach Soul. As we wrap up, we want to remind our listeners of a few key points. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not substitute professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content shared here is based on professional opinion but may not apply to everyone's situation. Always consult with a qualified healthcare provider before making changes to your mental health care. If you're in a crisis, please seek immediate professional help or contact a crisis hotline. Listening to this podcast does not create a therapist-client relationship or personal advice. Please consult with your licensed mental health professional in your area. Remember, your mental health journey is unique. While we hope this information is helpful, it's crucial to work directly with the qualified personnel for your specific needs. Thank you again for tuning into Coach Soul, and we'll see you next time.